Hey everyone, and welcome to our November live event. Once again, we have Heather Thomas here to answer all of your quilting questions. Thanks for being here, Heather.
Thank you for having me. It's fun to be here.
Of course. All right, so we're going to start right off with our first question here from Terry. She says, I'm making an all applique quilt and need to know if when hand quilting a grid, do I go across the whole block or just the background?
That's a great question, and I'm so happy that you're going to be doing a grid in the background, and hopefully you're planning on doing that grid on the diagonal in the block. No, you do not quilt over the applique things with the grid, but I do highly suggest that you quilt in the applique things at least somewhere, and that's where you should start. So if your applique things are flowers, you can quilt around the center of the flowers or add some veins in the petals. If they're little sunbonnet Sues, then you can quilt in the little dress or around the cap, that sort of thing. And then do your grid. And so that grid would be diagonal from an upper corner to a bottom corner, and then the opposite upper corner to the opposite bottom corner. And a grid is a great way to show off applique, because applique often includes a lot of curves, and the perfect thing behind those curves is a straight grid. Especially one that's done on the diagonal. So no, don't stitch over your applique shapes with the thread that you're using for that grid, but do stitch in those applique shapes so that you have some hand quilting everywhere in the block, and you'll be great. It'll be wonderful.
Perfect. All right, we have a question that just came in here, and this is from JD. They say, I have a seam on my crazy quilt that is coming apart from sitting on it. Is there an easy way to fix it without taking the quilt apart?
Absolutely. Hopefully that you have enough left of fabric in that seam hasn't begun to ravel too much. If it has begun to ravel, then I would put a product on that edge called fray check to keep it from fraying anymore. And then I would simply turn that edge in just like you would when you're appliquing, and do a very tiny little whip stitch to close it up. You shouldn't have to take the quilt apart at all. Basically, you're simply going to applique those two undone sections back together, and it'll be good as new. I would go ahead and add some extra stitching in that area, some stitching that goes through from the front to the back, just a couple little hidden stitches, because that area has become weak, and that way you can make it strong again.
Sounds good. All right, next question here is from Donna, and she says that she loves watching your tips and would like to know what the best and easiest way to start to learn how to free motion quilt is.
You know, practice. And you can practice in one of two ways. You can put together a bunch of small squares, 10-inch squares or 8-inch squares just by themselves, square of fabric, piece of batting, a square of backing, and practice on those. Or what I suggest is that if you have a bunch of quilt tops laying around, choose the one that you have the least amount of emotional attachment to, baste it, and then start quilting it. When it comes to free motion quilting, you are going to find that either curvy things comes more naturally or straighter things come more naturally. Whatever you find success with when you first start, practice that first until you feel really comfortable with it. Then move to the more difficult things. Everybody seems to think that they should be able to get in there and stipple right away. Well, not everybody is a great stippler, because some people just don't have that curvy tendency. And they're much more rigid, and they like things straight and they like things tight. So go for straighter things, but definitely play with the stitching and try to enjoy it. Go slow in the beginning. You do not have to stitch pedal to the metal. At the most, in the very, very beginning, about half speed, half the maximum speed of your machine, and then slowly move up to 3/4 speed. And just do it methodically. Put some music on. If you need to relax, pour a glass of wine, nice scotch, whatever. But the music really, really helps, because it helps you build your rhythm. And simply practice first. We always think that we should be able to just jump into machine quilting and automatically be good at it, or at least be adequate at it. But for most of us, that's not going to happen. It takes a while to find the rhythm that you're going to build with you and your machine. So just take your time, do some practicing. At the minimum, I would say practice, 12 to 24 of those 10-inch blocks. Keep that first one that you did and keep the last one that you did, so you can compare the two. You're going to be really surprised at how much better you become, how much smoother your stitching is. But just practice. You don't need to take another class. You don't need to buy another book. You just need to sit in front of your machine and learn to dance with it.
Yeah, I can absolutely attest to how long it takes to learn that, because I came from a sewing background, years of sewing, I thought quilting was going to be easy because you make it look so easy. It's not. So I'm still in the practice stage. All right, our next question here is another one about free motion quilting, and this is from Jackie. And she says, I'm just starting to free motion quilt. I have an issue where every so often the upper thread is not catching the lower thread, so I have unstitched lines. Is this something I'm doing wrong? Am I moving too fast?
No, you're probably not moving too fast, unless what you're seeing is actually a really big stitch. So if that unstitched line is simply a really large stitch, if the stitch on the back is the same size as the stitch on the front, then that's a really large stitch, and then you're moving too fast. However, if you have some areas in the back where you can see that the bobbin tried to engage with the top thread, so there's some loops on the back, then that means there's something going on with your machine. One of the most common things that will cause your machine to skip stitches is a dull needle, or a needle that has a burr on the end of it. So my first thing would be to change your needle and put a fresh needle in. If you find that it's still happening, another thing could be basting spray. So if you're using any basting spray, that is the #1 culprit of causing skip stitches, because that's what that's called, as a skip stitch. If it's neither of those things, then my suggestion would be, are you getting any skip stitches when you're piecing? Because if that's happening too, then it's probably the timing of your machine. But #1, make sure that it's actually skip stitches and not just a big stitch. If it is a big stitch, then, slow down. You don't have to be racing with that machine. Then check to see if it's a burr in your needle or a dull needle. And remember that those needles are really only good for about 4 to 8 hours of sewing. And it's more like 4 hours when you're doing the free motion quilting, because we beat those needles up. So a fresh needle is always a good option. Stay away from the basting spray, or use it very, very, very sparingly, and keep a little cotton ball with alcohol on it near your machine so that you can wipe down that needle, so if it gets any goo on it, it doesn't stick and cause those skip stitches. If it's not one of those things, then you might need to take your machine in and have the timing checked.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here is from Barb. And she says, should I draw a sketch first to make an art quilt? What do you do to get inspired to start your art quilts?
It's a good question, Barb, when it comes to whether or not to sketch first. Some people really think sketching is important. I have never been much of a sketcher. I don't like to sketch. Namely, I can't draw worth a hooey. And so it would never really look like that anyway. And for me, the joy is in the call and response that takes place while you're creating something. What I mean by that is, when I gather together all my supplies, and this is kind of how I start on a quilt, is I gather together all the supplies I want to play with, the colors of fabrics I want to use, any embellishments I want to use, any story I want to tell, bringing them together and look at them and see what happens when they start to interact with each other. And then I make a move. And once I've made that move, those things start to respond, and they put out a call and ask me to do something else. And then I do that something else, and it responds. And it's this back and forth that happens that I find totally intoxicating. So if I had a drawing, I would feel kind of beholden to follow that drawing. And so it's just not for me. But I know lots of artists who do complete drawings. They'll do a small rendering, they'll do a larger rendering, they'll take it to a shop and have it blown up to the size they want to do it in. And that's the way they like to work. So there's no right or wrong way of doing it. There's simply what turns you on, what makes you happy, and what gives you the results that you want in the end run. Generally speaking, for me, when I begin a quilt, an art quilt, it's because I have something I want to prove. I want to prove the way colors move. I want to prove how textures blend with colors. I want to tell a story. I want something that didn't exist before to come forward. And I want to be able to allow that to happen naturally and not force it. So one of my biggest tricks, and something that I've taught my students for years and years when they're making art quilts, especially because there's so many techniques out there and there's so many fabrics and products and all these things, is think of working with groups of threes. So 3 different products. Fabric would be one. If you're going to do decorative stitching, that would be a product or an idea, and then beading, those 3 things. Or fabric, and let's say it's silk fabric, and you have some really cool wood sticks you want to include, and hand stitching. Those are three things, three ideas, and three is a great thing to bring together. And so bring all those things together and look at them together and see how they interact with each other, and see how you feel like you can bring them together into a cohesive story. And then choose three sort of techniques that you're going to use. I'm going to do this kind of piecing, and I'm going to do this kind of quilting, I'm going to do this kind of embellishing, so that you're not trying to stick a million things into one piece. And take it slow and easy. So find the thing that makes you happy. There is no one prescription for everybody. Try a few different methodologies, and what's going to happen is you're going to hit yours, and it's going to make it sing for you, and you're going to go, oh, this is the way I'm supposed to work. You'll find it, I promise you. Just play.
So when you're working through building a design, do you ever take things out and start over, or do you just keep kind of adding and changing and see how it evolves?
I rarely ever take anything out and start over. And in fact, when I was designing and patterns and selling kits and all those things, I always worked from the fabric out. So I would take the fabric I wanted to work with, and I would make a block. And if I liked that block, I'd make some more. And when I was tired of making those blocks, I'd figure out how to put them together. And if they weren't big enough, I'd throw on some borders. And then when I was done, and I would take notes during that, so that if I liked the piece when I was done, I could then write the pattern. So the pattern was always written after the quilt was made, whereas most people design the quilt first and then make the quilt. But once the quilt was designed, I'd be bored. I'd be done. I already know what it's going to look like. What's the thrill in that? So everybody has their own methodology, and feel free to throw things away. It's only a little bit of fabric. It's better to throw something away that's not working and not beat yourself up, and just try something else. And play. It's just like with the machine quilting, you have to practice. With art quilting, you have to be willing to explore and play.
Absolutely. Plus, I'm pretty sure we have several videos on our site where you've taken pieces you didn't like and either added stamping to them, added something to them, cut them up, made something else. So,
oh yeah, yeah.
All sorts of things.
I make some ugly stuff that has to be fixed, but I make a lot of stuff. And that's the other thing too, is that if you get all caught up in the one piece, you'll spend all your time and energy on that. Make a lot of work, because the more work you make, the more good work you'll make. Most artists know that 1 in 10 pieces that they finish is going to be really, really good. If you only make 2 pieces a year, it's going to take you a long time to get to really good. You make 100 pieces a year, like I used to do, at least 100 pieces a year, you're going to have 10, 12, maybe 15 really good pieces. And so just, work. Just do it. Nike.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here is from Sarah, and she says, how do you make your quilt lines thick like the ones back in the old days?
Your quilt linings thick?
It says quilt lines, so I'm thinking the thread lines, stitch lines.
Oh, you mean the actual thread itself?
Yeah. Yeah.
You use a heavier thread. That's your basic thing is using a heavier thread. You might want to move to a size 18 thread or a size 28 thread or a size 25. They're a little harder to find, but you can find them. But if that's what you're thinking, is that you want a thicker line, then you need a heavier thread. And the lower the number of the thread, the heavier that thread is.
Do you need to adjust your machine at all when you're using that heavier thread?
You shouldn't need to adjust your machine. Every once in a while, there'll be a machine around that will want you to. What you need to do is you need to have a bigger needle. So, the heavier the thread is, the larger the needle. And when you're working with a thread that heavy, my suggestion would be to work with a size 100 needle.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is from Marie, and she says, can you please tell me what freezer paper is used for in quilting?
Freezer paper can be used for a lot of things. A lot of people use it mostly for templates because you can iron it to the fabric. The waxy side will stick temporarily to the fabric when you iron it to it. I use it to stabilize fabric with. You can use it when you're thread painting. It's wonderful. It's just like a stabilizer, and it's cheap. And I usually use 2 or 3 layers of it. And you can use it when you're appliquing. You can use it even for paper piecing, because then the pieces kind of stay in place when you iron them on there, and they don't shift and move. So basically it's a stabilizer or a template. That's what we use that freezer paper for.
And when you say the waxy part sticks to it, I mean, you can peel it off and there's no residue or anything left.
No residue or anything. It just comes right off. Yep, it's wonderful. Yep.
Perfect. It's one of those things you always probably have in your kitchen anyway. You might as well just use it.
Might as well use it.
All right, our next question here is from Kitty. She says, I've been quilting less than a year and I'm still having difficulty with mitered corners and also bindings. Any suggestions you have would be helpful.
Could you repeat that question again?
Yep. She's looking for tips on mitered corners and binding.
Is it the mitered corners in the binding or is it mitered corners in the piecing?
I would assume in the binding.
In the binding, okay. So when you do a double French binding, which is what most of us are doing, and we don't even know that's what it's called. But anytime we fold our fabric over doubled and then sew that doubled fabric raw edges together to the front of our quilt and then turn it over to the back and then hand stitch it on, or even machine stitch it on, that is a double French binding. And when you go to those corners, there's this wonderful little folding technique that you do. And one of the best ways to understand that is to practice it with a piece of paper. But simply, you're going to bring your long strip of binding all the way to the corner of your quilt, stopping 1/4 of an inch away. And so what I do is I mark that 1/4 of an inch away with a pin, a straight pin. And I sew to the pin, and then I back stitch. And then you're going to turn your quilt a 1/4 turn. And you're going to flip up your strip of binding. So you're flipping it up once you've turned that 1/4 turn. And then you're going to flip it back to you, making a fold on that edge, the edge that's farthest from you. And that fold is going to run exactly with the raw edge of the quilt. And then you're going to start sewing again using your 1/4 inch seam. And when you do this, when you turn that over, it's going to have a perfect miter on the front. Then on the back, you have to fold that miter in. And that's, you know, one of the key points is that you've got to fold that miter in, and you can fold it and press it and then pin it so that you're ready when you get there. And that's generally what I do is I'll stitch till I'm about 5 inches away from the corner, and then I'll fold it and pin it and press it really, really well so that I've got that nice tight miter in the corner. Make sure that you stitch down those miters on the front and the back, especially if you're ever going to put your quilt into a show, because that's one of the things that the judges will look at. So I hope that helps. I know we have some binding videos that I highly would suggest you watch, because that little folding can be a little tricky for some people.
Absolutely, yep, and I can second that. We definitely have tons of binding videos. Heather's even done several for us available on the website, so you can check those out for a more visual to what she just explained. All right, our next question here is from Brenda, and she says she's making a log cabin table runner, and it tells her to cut several 1-inch strips. She says this is only going to leave 1/2 inch after the 2/4 inch seams, and she wants to know if you think that's too narrow.
Well, you know, what I think is probably not all that important. It's what the pattern designer had in mind. And if you look at the picture of the quilt, it'll probably give you a better idea, the picture that's on the front of the pattern. My suggestion would be to follow the pattern and make a couple of blocks. Don't do all of your cutting. Make a couple of blocks. Make sure you like it. Make sure you think it looks good. And then also say, okay, well, was there a mistake? Did she forget to put in the 1/2 inch? Because, you know, we're all human, and she could have done that when it comes to her cutting instructions. That being said, I used to have a pattern that I produced, one of my most popular patterns, that was a log cabin that formed flowers. And my strips were cut 3/4 of an inch. So we had 1/4 of an inch of fabric on the front and 1/2 inch of fabric when it comes to it on the back in those seam allowances. So, you know, it can be done. A really narrow strip for a log cabin is pretty sexy, so it could be accurate. Give it a whirl. We got to trust those pattern writers when we buy those patterns, at least to give it a shot. So yeah, go for it. 1 inch.
Well, and if you don't like it, I mean, that should be a fairly easy pattern to enlarge, right?
Enlarge, yeah, absolutely. Yep.
All right. All right, our next question here is one thing that I've never thought of doing before, but Linda wants to know how you can trim a cutting mat to make it smaller.
With a pair of scissors. You'd be amazed.
Not your fabric scissors.
Not your fabric scissors, but your paper scissors, or an old pair of scissors, or a pair of kitchen shears. Kitchen shears are fabulous, but this product that you don't really cut with a rotary cutter can be cut with scissors. It's amazing to me. I have cut so many mats down. I carved my own rubber stamps, and old mats are one of the best things to glue onto the back because it keeps them stabilized, but they're still kind of movable. And so when you're printing on fabric, they're really nice. So I have cut so many old mats. I used to say to people, if you have an old mat, give it to me. I need it for the backs of my stamps. And they're cut fabulously with a pair of scissors.
I don't know why I never would have thought of doing that. I've just never crossed my mind. Okay. Our next question here is from Shelly, and she says she's new to quilting. She is cross-stitching multiple stamped quilt blocks and wants to know what the best way to put the blocks together for a quilt would be.
Well, because they're cross-stitched, I would definitely suggest that you use sashing. If you were to stitch all of those blocks right together with all the same background, it would be rather boring to look at. And if you're going to use sashing, you might as well use cornerstones, because then it's going to be easier to sew your rows together, because those cornerstones kind of tell you where one row begins and the next row ends. So to do that, you're simply going to cut strips, whatever width you want your sashing to be. And this is important. If you have big blocks, then you can get away with wider sashing. But if you have small blocks, it needs to be narrower sashing. So basically, you never want your sashing to be more than 1/4 of the width of your block. So if you have 8-inch blocks, then 2-inch sashing. If you have 10-inch blocks, you could do 2.5-inch sashing. You don't have to do that big, but don't do any bigger than that. So you can choose your sashing size. So let's say your blocks are 10 inches and you want to do a 2-inch sashing. So you're going to cut that sashing 2.5 inches because you've added in your seam allowance. And you're going to cut half the sashing you need to 2.5 inches by 10 inches and sew it to 2 sides of all of your blocks. And then you're going to stitch, to cut more of those that are also the 2.5 by 10 inches, and you're going to sew a cornerstone in between each of them. And that cornerstone is going to be the same magic number you're using already, that 2.5 inches, but it's going to be a square. And you're going to sew one of those in between each of those sashing pieces to make the long rows that will go between the blocks that you already have the 2 sides on. And that's how easy it is to sew on sashing. So that is definitely what I would do between those blocks. You could use just one fabric as the sashing and then lots of different fabrics as your cornerstones. You could use several fabrics, 10 fabrics as your sashing and 1 fabric as your cornerstones. There's all kinds of options. But when you get done with those blocks, look at them and say, you know, what's going to make them look more jazzy? What's going to hold them together and make it much more attractive to the viewer? What's going to make the viewer want to stay with the piece longer? And then go for those fabrics or those colors.
Perfect. I actually just made a quilt for the first time using cornerstones. I had never added them in before. I didn't think to do them so wide though, so mine ended up literally like these little 1/4 inch little ones, but I liked it, liked the way it turned out.
Good.
Our next question here is from Bridget, and she says she's using a microfiber cuddle type for backing of a baby quilt that has a 100% cotton top and wants to know if she should still use batting or if batting is not necessary because she has such a thick backing fabric.
Well, you can option either way. The one thing about the batting is that it actually helps to hold those 2 layers together when you're stitching. There's a lot less shifting and moving. When you have a slick fabric like the backing of that minky or whatever it is you're using, the back side of it is very slick, and then the back of your cotton is somewhat slick. And if you have those 2 right next to each other, then they're going to be moving and shifting and moving and shifting the whole time you quilt, even if you baste really well. Whereas if you put just a thin layer of batting in there, it's going to keep them from moving quite so much. And that minky can be pretty tight, pretty tough to work with. And I'm going to have to say this because I can't not say it.
We all know what you're going to say.
I know you know what I'm going to say, but this person may not. But if you really care about that baby that you're giving that quilt to, remember that minky is highly flammable, highly flammable. And when it catches fire, it turns into hot molten plastic. So maybe flannel on the back of that quilt, or a nice double weave gauze that's out of 100% cotton. Any of those things that are nice and soft would be better for baby in the long run. So that's my public service announcement.
well, so continuing on that, she asked what kind of batting to use too. So you don't like polyester batting, right? So
No, I think polyester batting is really bad. My favorite batting to use for baby quilts is called Echo, ECCO batting, and it's made from corn. And the reason I like it so well is because when it catches fire, it actually turns into water vapors and puts itself out. So it's the safest batting. And what's really cool is that it looks and acts like the polyester. It's got nice loft, so everything's soft and cuddly. And so that makes a great baby quilt. And if you don't like the 100% Echo batting that's got the higher loft, you can use the half Echo and half cotton. And that's really nice too. It's gonna give you a more contemporary look to your baby quilt. But it's a great batting. A lot of quilt stores don't carry it, but you can always ask them to order them for you.
Absolutely. Plus, you can find so many things online too. There's so many fabric places, and you can order it there too as well.
Yeah.
All right. Our next question here came in. This is from Sunny. She says, I'm trying to just straight stitch to quilt my quilt. The fabric drags and I get very short stitches. I've tried using the walking foot and a regular foot to see if it makes a difference. The walking foot seems to be worse, but I know I should be using it. I've tried varying the tension to no avail. What should I do?
Well, my first question is do you have the walking foot on properly? In machine quilting classes, I was always so surprised how often somebody would forget to put the arm of the walking foot around or on top of the needle bar. So depending on your machine, the walking foot should have an arm on the side of it that should either rest on top of your needle bar or go around your needle bar. So if it's got like a U shape, it would go around your needle bar, and this helps that walking foot go up and down. And so is your walking foot on correctly? Is your walking foot the right walking foot for your machine? If your machine didn't come with a walking foot, are you sure you purchased one that is got the right shank height? Is it a short shank or a long shank? Does it really go with your brand of machine? Because a walking foot should not create any drag whatsoever on any machine if it's the right machine, right walking foot, and if it's put on properly. So that's my first thing, is that either you've got the wrong foot or you don't have it put on right. It's really hard to machine quilt with your regular foot unless you can change your presser foot pressure. That's hard to say. You can try it 3 times fast. But some machines have a little knob on the left-hand side up by the head of the machine where you can change that presser foot pressure, and you can make it less so that the foot doesn't put as much pressure down on the fabric as it normally would. I used to have a machine that's what I did instead of putting a walking foot on, and it was wonderful. It worked beautifully. It was no problem whatsoever. So that is an option if your machine will do that. But that's the most important thing with that walking foot, is that it's either on wrong or it's the wrong foot for your machine. So you're going to have to look at that. If you bought your machine at a reputable dealer, you should be able to go to that dealer and say, you know, what's going on here? Is this not the right foot, or do I not have it on right? If you bought everything online, it's a little harder. I always tell people, when you buy your sewing machine, be careful of where you buy it from, because you're not just buying that sewing machine, you're buying the service of that dealer, and that dealer should be there for you to help you with any problems you might have with that machine. So check that foot fit out first. Ooh, that was another tongue twister. That foot fit out first, and then see if it's the right foot for your machine and get a different one if it isn't, or put that baby on correctly and try it again.
Absolutely. And we actually just got a question earlier today about whether or not there was such things as a universal foot. And I know you can get feet that are advertised as that, but I've never really had one work properly for me.
Back in the day. Okay, so universal feet are from back in the day. So back before we had computerized machines, and back before we had quilting as an industry. Once quilting became an industry, then the sewing machine manufacturers became very specialized and very competitive. And some manufacturers even have feet that don't fit their own brands if they're different models. They're that specialized. It is a money-making machine. And so there almost is no universal foot anymore. I can go in and get universal feet for my little machine that I have now, because my little machine is, 45 years old. It's an old all metal Brother, and I can go into any store and get a foot that fits because it takes all those quote unquote universal feet. But if you've got a newer machine, a machine that's less than 20 years old, chances are it's got machine and model specified feet, and you need to make sure you get the ones that fit your machine so that they can do the jobs you want them to do.
Absolutely. All right, our next question that just came in here is from Diane, and she says, can you define what floating a block is?
Can I define what floating a block is? Are you trying to stump me, Diane? The only thing I can think of that floating a block is the same as tilting a block, meaning that you're going to put it in some background one way or another so that the block has things around it to make it show up more. That is the only thing I would think that floating is, would be putting something around it so that it shows up more. And you can do that by simply putting sashing around it, or by tilting it, which is another way of putting sashing, but then you cut it a certain way so that it turns the block and tilts it. But that's all I would know about floating a block.
That's
a good one.
Same here. The only term I've ever heard floating with is when it comes to embroidery. So I don't even know anything for terms of quilting.
Yeah.
All right, our next question here is from Rita, and she says she would love to know how you decide what your quilting motifs will be.
That's a really good one, and I have to tell you, it's a pretty easy decision most of the time. The straighter my piecing is, so if I've got lots of squares and lots of lines in my piecing, then I'm going to put lots of curvy quilting. If I've got lots of curves in my piecing, meaning I've got applique or I've got freeform curves or those sorts of things, then I'm going to put lots of straight lines in my quilting. It's this opposition of the two that creates added interest. And if you do things that are repetitive too much, things become dull and boring and you stop seeing them. So if you have circles pieced in your quilt or circles printed on the fabric of your quilt, then I wouldn't put circles in the quilting. I would put straight lines in the quilting. So the opposites of what are going on is usually your best bet when it comes to the quilting. Also remember this, and this is very, very, very important. When you're deciding how you're going to quilt your quilt, the last thing you want to do is to create competition between your quilting designs and the design of the quilt top. One or the other has to shine, and if you make them both shine, they're just going to compete and fight with each other. So if you've got a very ornate or decorative or intense quilt top, the quilting should be very simple. If you've got a very simple quilt top, then that allows you to do very elaborate quilting. Don't do both. Elaborate and elaborate is just overdone, and you stop seeing anything. Boring and boring, or dull and dull, or simple and simple is not going to ask anybody to look at that quilt. So you want the quilting and the piecing to play off of each other and support each other. The number one thing that quilting is for is holding those layers together. The secondary thing is to add visual interest to the quilt. And it can't do that if it's competing with anything on the surface. So that's kind of how I choose. I don't choose because it's my favorite stitch to do. I choose because I think it's going to serve the piece well.
And I know we have a video on our site that you've done that's even called How to Quilt This Quilt, or How Do I Quilt This Quilt? So again, another visual to what she's just explaining that can help you decide what you want to do for your quilting.
Very good.
Our next question here is from Sherry, and she says, how do you tie off threads if it breaks when you're quilting?
Well, you don't really tie them off. At least I don't. There are some quilters who do. So I'm going to tell you how they do it. What they would do is they would pull out the thread until it's long enough to get a needle on it, tie a quilter's knot, and bury that thread, and then start stitching again. Those are people who are concerned about judging in a judge show and are looking for quote unquote perfection in their quilts, and they hand tie off all of their ends. And then there are people like me who want things to be very attractive and are going to do the best they can to make really attractive, sellable quilts with great duration, but aren't into perfection. And so what I do when my thread breaks, or if I run out of my bobbin, because the same thing is going to happen either way, is I begin stitching about 4 or 5 stitches behind where the thread broke or where the bobbin thread ran out, so that I'm stitching over my last 4 or 5 stitches that I made. Before I begin stitching, I tie a nice good knot, and I do that by holding the quilt sort of in place. I actually shimmy it back and forth ever so slightly while I take 3 or 4 stitches. And then I stitch and make sure I stitch right over those last 4 or 5 stitches that I made before the thread broke or before I ran out of bobbin. And that way I'm kind of sealing those stitches in, and I don't have to worry about them coming loose.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is from Donna. And she says she's fairly new to quilting. She likes panels, but she finds that they are not evenly printed on fabric, and it's difficult to square it up so they can be used in quilting. Do you have any suggestions on how to kind of combat that?
Well, you are right, Donna. They are not printed straight on the fabric, and I'm going to tell you a couple reasons why. First of all, not all, so don't come back at me and bite me later, but not all, but most panels are printed by companies who make low-end fabrics. So these are not high-end fabrics. They are fabrics that have a much looser weave than we normally use for quilting. It's usually about sometimes it's a 28 threads per inch, when normally our normal quilting cotton is 40 or 42 threads per inch. So it's pretty loosely woven, and it's just not a high grade gray goods, and that's G-R-E-I-G-E, gray goods. And that is the fabric that we actually have the prints printed on. And so it's just not a good quality fabric to begin with. And the process that they use is very quick and dirty. And so they're just wanting to get that fabric printed, and often it's very, very crooked. But then you do have some companies, some of the higher end companies, that are also printing patterns these days. They try a lot harder to get those panels printed straight on the fabrics, but it's pretty hard to do because of the way the fabric is held in place on the 2 sides during the printing process. So what you want to do is actually cut out your panels using a pair of scissors along the far edge where the seam allowance is, instead of using your rotary cutter and a ruler. What's really interesting is that then you can take that panel and you can actually kind of put a ruler right next to the cut edge, not on the fabric, and you can iron that fabric and push it to that ruler and make it straight, just for the piecing. Once you have the piecing done, then go in and quilt it well, so that it doesn't unstretch back out and become all goofy. So you can make them true after the cutting. You can actually stretch them out too against that ruler if you want to before the cutting, but that's the way I've dealt with panels in the past, because it's just almost impossible to print straight on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of yards of fabric as they're being printed.
So you've done a video for us before where you say grain matters sometimes. So do you always have to worry about the panels being on grain?
No. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as our grandmothers were concerned, because, you know, at least 60 to 80% of the quilts that were made before the turn of the century were made with scraps and leftovers. There were the wealthy women who were making beautiful quilts from bought yardage. But a good deal of the quilts were made from scraps. And what they cared about was the scrap big enough for the piece they needed? They didn't care about the grain. They knew that there was going to be so many little pieces put together and then stitches put on top that it was okay. Where grain matters is in your borders. It's important that you have your borders on grain, especially if you care about how your quilts drape over the edge of your bed. They're not all wobbly. Or, as we do so often these days, how they hang. And they won't hang well if the borders aren't cut or, horrible word, ripped on grain. I don't rip any fabrics when it comes to exact piecing, but I will rip the fabrics for my borders because I only use really high-end fabric. I won't use loosely woven fabric that shows white after it's been ripped. So yeah, grain only really matters in the borders.
That's still the one thing that you've yet to convince me to do is rip my fabric. I like my scissors and rotary cutter too much.
That's okay.
All right, our next question is from Debbie, and she wants to know how you control your quilts while quilting. She always ends up with a slightly crooked pattern.
A slightly crooked pattern. Well, what was her name again?
Debbie.
Debbie. Well, Debbie, I always end up with a slightly crooked pattern. You know, the quilting world is changing, and I cannot believe it, but I've become kind of an old world girl, even though I've been the queen of the newfangled stuff for so long. The more long arm quilting we have, and the more computerized quilting we have, the more difficult it is for us to compare our quilting to others. I can't get a perfectly unwobbly pattern all the time either. And the only thing I know that can is a computerized machine, or somebody who's working on a long arm or even a short arm with some of these new rulers. There's all sorts of rulers out there now that are not the type of rulers you cut with. They're actually rulers that you attach to your machine or to your foot or to the needle in some cases that will actually help you get a straighter line. I'm not sure that the straighter line is the best thing. I am seeing quilts left and right on Facebook, on Pinterest, at shows, that the quilting is so quote unquote perfect that in my opinion, they just look like a mattress topper. So there's no personality to them. There's no chutzpah. So my suggestion to you would be perhaps choose patterns that you want to quilt onto your, or motifs that you want to quilt onto your quilt that don't need to be straight, and embrace the curve. There was this art show that I watched one time on PBS, and this young artist, about 25 years old, said something that changed my life. And what she said was, the beauty is in the wobbly line. And I swear I held on to that, and I started looking at art differently, and she was right. The beauty is in the wobbly line. It is the person who made it. You can see that person in the wobbly line. You cannot see it in the perfect machine-made line. What you see there is the machine. So
it's funny that you say that, because as soon as you started talking about this, I wrote that down because I've heard you say it like 100 times, and so I was going to throw it out there, and you beat me to it. So, all right. All right. Our next question here is from Mary Elizabeth, and she wants to know, should pre-cut fabrics such as jelly rolls and charm squares be pre-washed before piecing?
Well, you know, again, this is a personal decision, and it's, what is that? How is it going to be used? If it's a wall quilt, probably not so much of a big deal. Table runner, definitely a big deal. Baby quilt, definitely a big deal. That's one of the problems with the pre-cuts, is that they're hard to launder. So, you know, I would definitely launder the quilt as soon as I was done if I didn't pre-launder them. So I think it's up to you. If you've got let's say you've got a grouping of 2-inch strips from a jelly roll, and they're all really deep and dark, and when you touch them, they feel a little stiff. Chances are they've got excess pigment on the surface to get that deep, rich color. So what I would suggest is take one of those darker fabrics and rub it on a white paper towel. If color shows on that white paper towel, which it is very likely to show, then I would very carefully pre-wash those fabrics, or wash that quilt the minute I'm done. But I would wash it with a product called Synthropol. That's SYNTHRAPOL. And Synthropol, what it does is it's simply a surfactant. It's an industrial surfactant that pulls the excess dyes and pigments away from the surface of the fabric and holds them in the water so they can't go back down on any of the fabrics in the wash. So that means if you've got white and deep dark colors from your jelly roll pieced together in a quilt, the first time you launder it, those dark colors are not going to bleed or color transfer onto that white. And there's a big difference between those two words. Bleeding is what happens when those two fabrics that are pieced next to each other, you can see what darker color leach onto the lighter color right at the seam line. That is bleeding, one color bleeding into the other. Transferring is what happens when you leave a dark fabric sitting on top of a light fabric when they're wet, and the dyes or colors transfer to each other. And that can happen by leaving the wet thing in the washing machine just for 2 seconds after it stops spinning or the water's gone out. But Synthropol will keep that from happening. Most reputable quilt stores now carry that product. I know you can get it on 1,000 different places online. And I use it for all of my fabric and, frankly, all of my laundry. Why have more than one laundry detergent when you can have the same one for everything? And so that's what I use. Follow the instructions on the bottle and you'll be good to go, whether you wash before you make your piece or after you've finished your piece.
So say you decide to not wash your pre-cuts because it's too hard and you don't want to do all that pressing afterwards. If you're going to combine that with a quilt that has other yardage, do you wait and not wash the yardage so you don't have one that's pre-washed and one that's not? Does that matter?
You're going to be best off if you have everything either pre-washed or everything not pre-washed. However, if you quilt heavily, meaning you quilt at least every ½ inch or so, and I do say or so, it doesn't mean have to be a ½ inch everywhere. But if you quilt close together, you're going to make all those fabrics behave like one. That's the beauty of machine quilting, is that you take all these piece things and make them behave like one solid piece of fabric, and you make them behave like a conjoined fabric with your batting and your backing. But that doesn't happen if you quilt far away, and it doesn't happen if you have big areas with no quilting at all. So you can take care of a lot of those issues by quilting properly.
All right. Speaking of pre-washing, we have a question here from Carol, and she says, should batting be pre-washed?
Goodness, no. There was a time when we had to pre-wash because the batting manufacturers hadn't caught up with us yet. And nowadays, did I just say that? Nowadays. Yeah. Nowadays, all of the battings are treated much better than they used to be. They don't have cottonseed left in them, and cottonseed was one of the things we had to worry about because it would put little oil marks on our quilts when we did launder our quilts, especially if we put them in the dryer or had heat involved. But they've been pre-shrunk mostly. So it's important that you understand what your batting is going to do. And so if it has a label on it, read your label. It should tell you what its shrink rate is. And if you've already pre-washed your fabrics and they've already done any shrinking they're going to do, and you want a contemporary looking quilt, make sure you use a batting that has a very low shrink rate, 1 or 2% at the most. If you like a very old-fashioned rumply looking quilt, then I would go ahead and use a higher shrink rate batting, and then that batting is going to shrink and pull all those fabrics up, and you're going to have that nice rumply old-fashioned look. But the quilting is going to affect that too, how far apart or how close together, and then the batting is going to affect that according to its shrink rate. But you shouldn't have to pre-wash any battings these days.
Is shrink rate advertised on a batting, or do you just have to know about batting?
Advertising on it usually says something on the batting. If it's a polyester batting, of course, it's not going to say anything because that does not shrink. But any of the rest of the batting should say that. When you buy the batting off the big roll, there should be a piece of paper that's nearby that's pinned to it or something that tells you about that batting. If there isn't, then don't buy that batting, because it's like buying, off-brand milk or something. You don't even know what it is. Know what your batting is. Read the instructions that go with it. Read the information. The manufacturer put it there for a reason. He put it there so that you could understand what that batting was going to do.
Absolutely. All right. Our next question here from Carol again, and she says, do you know where I could find a ruler with a handle?
I don't know of any rulers that come with handles, but I do know that there are lots of handles that you can buy to put on any ruler. And so what I would do is go online and just put in quilt ruler handle, and you're going to come across 1,000 different places where you can buy them. Most of them have suction cups on them. Some have these little knobs that you turn that make the suction really, really tight, and they're fabulous, especially if you have any problems with your hands and you have a hard time picking up that ruler. It also proves my point that when you cut and hold your ruler, you should be holding your ruler with a claw rather than a flat hand, because when you hold that handle, it's a claw, and you're taking your weight off of that ruler and you're not slipping around as much. So yeah, there are handles to be had, but none that are sold directly on that I know of.
Right. And speaking of her claw, she does have a video on our website demonstrating how to use a ruler if you want another visual of that. Speaking of rulers and tools, we have a question from Linda that says she's just beginning in quilting and wants to know what tools she absolutely has to have to start.
That's a great question. I am a minimalist, and I know I've taught. I mean, literally, I know I've taught at least 10,000 different students in the years I've been teaching, and there are people who are very careful with their money and only want the absolute necessary tools, and then there are people who quilting is their game, their play, their everything, and they are more than happy to throw money at it all the time, and they want to have every new tool and ditty that comes along that could be used in quilting. What I think is really important for quilting is that you have a machine that is easy for you to use. You have one long ruler that is at least 6 inches wide and 24 inches long, and one short ruler. The 18 by 3 is really perfect, and one square ruler. I believe the 12 by 12 is usually enough, or the 12.5 by 12.5. Those 3 rulers are going to get you by and make cutting easy for you. You could get by with just the one long 6 by 24, but it's a little cumbersome sometimes, and it's hard to square up corners without at least a 12-inch square ruler. Then you need a really good rotary cutter and extra blades for that rotary cutter, so you're always working with sharp blades. You need a mat to cut on, and it should be at least the 18 by 24. If you want to go to the bigger one, great, but I wouldn't get the smaller one. You're just going to have to get a bigger one in the long run. You need some good straight pins, and my favorite straight pins are silk pins. I think silk pins are the bee's knees, and I prefer the ones that have the little tiny metal heads. And don't buy those at discount stores, because those silk pins aren't really silk pins. They just put that label on them. Make sure those silk pins are long and skinny. If they look short and chunky, then they're just telling you a fib. So some great pins are a really good idea. Some fabric, some good scissors that you can cut with, and some good scissors that you can clip threads with. And those two are not the same thing. You never want to cut fabric with your thread snips, because it separates the blades and then they're not going to cut threads anymore. So those are important too. A seam ripper, and clover is my favorite seam ripper. It's very, very sharp. I like it. And I think that's about it. Some patterns to use, or a book or two. I think one of your best things that you can buy is a beginning quilters book. And my favorite, and I'm not even sure if it's still out, is by Fons and Porter. It was a great book on beginning quilting. But something that kind of tells you, how to cut blocks, how to piece some basic blocks, how to put some sashing on, the difference between a straight set and a diagonal set, blah, blah, blah. And then a really basic beginning machine quilting or hand quilting book, so that you can kind of dispel the myths that are out there. And then watch videos. We've got all kinds of videos here that you can watch. Stick to the basic ones in the beginning when you just start learning, and then start, watching more of the exotic ones. But you don't need a whole lot. You need some patience. And if you don't have any, the quilting might teach it to you. And then, cut yourself some slack and have some fun while you're doing it.
I think I need to go buy a new ruler, because I only have a 24 by 3.5 inch. So I need a wider one.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
All right. So you kind of answered this question in our last one. Jean wanted a reminder about the type of pins you like to use for your quilt sandwiches. But then talk a little bit about the difference between using those silk pins versus using a safety pin, and why you like one over the other.
Okay. Well, safety pins have really, really big metal bits to them, and they can actually leave holes in your tightly woven fabric. So if you tend to quilt with a lot of batiks, you could be making holes by using safety pins. So that's one of the reasons I don't like them. They're hard to close. They hurt my fingers when I close them. And they're always in the way, and I can't stitch over them. So I was always looking for a way to hold my layers together and not have to remove safety pins or worry about those safety pins. So one day I came upon silk pins. One of my students had them in class, and I was like, oh, these are sexy pins. They're long and they're skinny, and they break easily, and they have these little, you can get them with glass heads, but those aren't the ones you want. They have these little tiny metal heads that can be hard to pick up, and they for some people there is a learning curve of using them. But the two brands that I can attest to are Iris, I-R-I-S, and IBC. Those are the capital letters I, B, and C. Those two are really, really good brands of silk pin. I happen to buy the Iris silk pins in this big, big box, big round metal container that has wait for it, 10,000 pins in it. Most of the ones you get at the quilt stores have 500 pins in it. So I know that I go through the pins. They get lost in my carpet. I step on them all the time. I throw them away. They bend, they break. I don't care. They're heaven. They're absolute heaven. So they're silk pins. And the reason I use these is because I know this is a horrible thing, and all those sales people and those repair people of sewing machines are going to just cringe. Because I can sew right over them. They are so thin. I can sew right over them. If I can't sew right over them, why do I want to use a pin? It's holding stuff. I need it to hold it until I've sewn it. So 9 years I've been machine basting this, or basting this way for my quilts. And in all those 9 years, I've only broken a needle one time. And that's because I hit a head. And that was my own fault for not paying attention. When I first started using them, I would get scratches on my arms because, you know, I've got those little pin heads or tips that are sharp. But after a while, you get used to it. So I can put them in place and I can sew right over them, and I don't have to stop what I'm doing. I don't have to slow down to remove something. They're heaven. They're heaven.
So I use them even just for when I'm doing piecing, and I do sew over them too. And like you said, you don't break a needle. The most you'll bend the pin because they're so thin. Yeah. But honestly, you can even straighten them back out, or if you have that many, you could probably throw one away.
Well, I used to give them to students all the time. You know.
All right. I don't even know what size of pin cushion you would need for that. All right. I thought this one was kind of a fun question here, and I know what my answer would be. But Beverly wants to know, if you could only have 2 colors of thread, what would they be?
For me, I really think there needs to be 3 colors of thread. But if there could only be 2, it would be a light gray and black. If there could be 3, okay. If there could be 3, there would be a slightly off white, a medium gray, and black.
And that is for, would you use that for both piecing and quilting and for everything?
If that was my only option, darn tootin' I would. Yeah, I'd make it work.
I was going to say black and white too, so yeah, we're close.
Very good.
All right, our last question here, this comes from Sue, and she says, is it really, and she puts a lot of emphasis on really, is it really possible to free motion quilt a twin or queen size quilt on your home machine?
What's her name again?
Sue.
Sue, of course it is. It's absolutely, really, completely possible. It's all I've ever owned is, you know, that regular sit-down machine. And even my quote-unquote mid-arm isn't really what they call mid-arms these days. It only had 11 inches. That's the opening. But the average machine has 4.5 or 5, maybe even 6 inches in the opening. And here's the thing is, stop thinking about the whole quilt and just think about the dinner plate size piece of quilt that you are driving around underneath that machine at that time. Get used to accordion folding the quilt up ever so slightly up against the inside edge of that machine, and then unaccordion folding it as you go. Get used to pushing up to the next level or next portion, or pulling back to the next portion. Use an L-shaped table. So your regular table that your machine is on, add another table to the left-hand side so that it forms an L, and you have that and your body to support all of that quilt. Don't roll it, don't fold it, don't clamp it, don't do any of that stuff. And just think about the dinner plate sized area in front of you that you're quilting, because that's all that matters right now. In the back of your head, have the next adjacent dinner plate sized area ready. And that's all you have to think about. Quit thinking about, oh my God, this is a queen size quilt under this little tiny machine. It doesn't matter.
So it should work as long as you've based it or pin based it and everything, and so nothing is going to pucker, right?
Exactly. You got to baste it nicely. I have a quilt here in my possession that my great grandmother's cousin machine quilted back in the late 1800s with no walking foot and no sexy silk pins. And it's white background with red stars, and she quilted on the red stars with a white thread, and on the white background with red thread, and it's machine quilted. So that tells you it was probably a treadle, and it's fabulous, and it's a queen size. Mm-hmm. If they could do it then, we're darn right we can do it now. It's all I've ever used. I've got quilts on my bed right now that I quilted on my regular old machine. Yeah.
And if you're worried about it, just start small and then work your way up. Start with that crib size, twin size, and you go from there.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, I love that little end there with a really old quilt. I think that's awesome. It was a good way to end it. I want to thank everyone for watching, for everyone who submitted questions beforehand, if you asked questions live or watched us the whole time here for the hour. And thank you, Heather, for answering all of our quilting questions. And
Thanks
we hope you all join us next month where she'll answer even more. Everyone have a good night.
Thanks a lot.